All right, everyone. Hey, welcome. It's Keith, and I am here with my good friend, Dr. Katy Valentine. You probably know that she's one of the co-hosts of the Heretic Happy Hour, along with me and Matt and Derek. She's also the author of a fascinating book called Sex, Slavery, and Self-Control in a Pauline Community, which is a fascinating title. And I think that's kind of what we want to get started here talking about. But first of all, hi, Katy. Welcome.
Hey Keith, how are you?
I'm doing really, really good. It's so great to see
Awesome.
you. Thank you for doing this.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So yeah, this is a fascinating topic, and I know you've done a lot of research on it. So I think what we talked about before we record, maybe if you can give us a little bit of a background on views of sex, again, I guess sort of like the kind of the thesis of your book, the way first century Christians thought about these topics, sexuality, and especially how women, were treated in this culture.
Yeah.
So let's kind of talk about that a little bit, help us understand that a little bit as a framework. But then I know we want to move from there into sexuality in terms of reconstruction. So help us understand, I guess, in the beginning, where is this coming from? What do we need? What do we not know?
Right. Yeah.
Assumptions that we make that are not true assumptions.
I think we make a lot of assumptions about New Testament, even about Old Testament. So I'll just kind of give a example from real life about assumptions that we make. So at one point, gosh, this was a long time ago before I met my partner, Joe. So this was more than 15 years ago, but I was on a date with someone who was a devout Christian and a little more conservative, or probably a lot more conservative than I was or am. And I don't know how the topic of prostitution or sex work came up, but somehow it did. We were not trying to explore this. We only went on like 2 dates, but he was like, yeah, no, but the Bible says like no prostitution. And I'm like, no. So that's an assumption, right? That's an assumption. Actually, what we have in the Bible is a variety of opinions on sex work and on prostitution.
Yes.
I think I must have been talking about a colleague of mine who did a Bible study with sex workers on how they interpret the Bible. I must have been talking about that, which is a fascinating book. Yeah, very cool book. But, so we see in the New Testament, for instance, in 1 Corinthians 5 or 6, where Paul talks to the community member who has been obviously hiring a prostitute. He didn't really say anything about the prostitute. He says a lot about the man.
Yeah.
We see the 2 prostitutes who come to King Solomon with the child. And King Solomon says, going to, cut the baby in 2 to find out who's the real mother. But there's no condemnation of them for being prostitutes.
Right. And the same with Jesus too, right? Jesus doesn't, he encounters prostitutes several times in his ministry. And what he does is bless them and honor them. He never rebukes them for their chosen profession.
Right. And so, even just making that little tweak, because there's sort of an assumption in popular Christian culture that prostitutes are people who are women who are sex workers, especially, are in it because they're like, they're sex addicts, or they're trying to like get by with something. In reality, we see people enter sex work usually because of economic downturns. Right. Yes. That's the primary reason. And this applies to women who are in poverty. It applies, and men too. It applies to people who have master's degrees as well. So this is, kind of across the gamut. So we find people who are exploited and also people who are empowered.
Yeah.
And so, when we think about the Bible, that's just one example. So other assumptions. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I clarify a little bit on that too? So like my assumption has been, kind of based on what you were saying, like my assumption has been that women in biblical times, whether it's first century or pre-first century, that they were really in those positions kind of, they didn't really have much of a choice. Like it is more about an economic or poverty situation where, the ideal for a woman was to be married. That was like the whole point. You need to get married, you need to have babies. And all your value is based on, can you have babies, and are you married, and are you like in that position? But if you somehow fail to get married, or you're divorced and kind of like you have no other options and you're just kind of pushed out, or however you end up there without a man, without being in this situation, your options are pretty limited. And prostitution is pretty much, if you want to survive, you're either going to just beg, or you're going to enter prostitution because this is the only way. In other words, it's more about your very limited range of options.
Yeah, limited range of options. And so I think that is true. We see in the ancient world, women, especially women, who are without kinship protection, whether in the form of a husband, father, brothers and sisters, siblings, yeah, right, and a more extended family network or community network who can help care for them. Sex work is one way for them to make a living that was, I don't want to say it was respectable, but it was common enough.
Yeah.
That it's also not like no one's going to blink an eye.
Right.
At this, or at the choice. So it was a legitimate form of work. It wasn't illegal or anything like that.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
Yeah. We all, the other options, like we see in the book of Ruth, is that you could glean a field.
Yes.
In ancient Israel, right? That's another way for you to sort of scrape by an existence. Like Ruth and Naomi are people without male kinship, without kinship really at all, until until Boaz comes along. But we also see like a sexy scene in the book of Ruth with Ruth and Boaz when she goes and lays at his feet. Feet is a euphemism there. So, our assumptions about like premarital sex, about all that kind of stuff, I think deserve to be re-looked at.
Yeah.
And one of the cool things I think about the early Jesus community is that we see renegotiation of kinship. And so this is really remarkable. It's not the only movement in the ancient world in the first century that had alternate forms of kinship. But what we see Jesus saying, very clearly in the story where his mother and brothers are coming to put him away, because his PR is so out there. He says very clearly, who's my mother? Who are my brothers? Yeah. You all are. And so, we see the early Christians are saying we can do kinship differently. Mm-hmm. Just, because you are, because you're, you are alone in the world, you're not alone in the world.
Yeah.
So to me, that's one of the more remarkable things about early Christianity. One of the things we do see in the second century that I love is that Christians would purchase other Christians enslaved people, for within their community as well, to give them and then grant them freedom, right, as well. And I think the sexuality. This is what my book is about. I think one of the reasons they're doing that is because enslaved people were automatically sexually vulnerable and could not abide by the emerging sexual ethics of early Christianity. So then if you purchase an enslaved person and free them, then they have a little more autonomy over their own body.
Yeah, it's sort of an issue of if you find yourself for whatever reason in this position of being a slave, and quite often it was economic, but you find yourself in that position, that's very true. Like the vulnerability, like you are at the mercy of whoever owns you, and
of any free person.
Yeah. Wow.
Actually, of any free person. So there's so many examples in the ancient world of, if someone who's enslaved by, Marcellus goes to the house of Flavia, and while they're there, Flavia is like, so-and-so needs a sexual partner, you're it.
Yep. Sorry.
I would direct them. So it didn't even have to be your owner.
Right.
So sexual vulnerability is part of being enslaved, ancient through today.
Yeah.
That's part of the work labor.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And you had said earlier too, a few minutes ago, when we were talking about like women and options for women in the ancient world, I think, it's true. It's a patriarchal culture. So the expectations are, women get married, they have children. What we also see emerging that I think is fascinating in the early Christian community, you see this in 1 Corinthians 7, the very beginning of it, when Paul says, many of you say that it is well for a man not to touch a woman. So we know that some ancient Corinthians were like, no, we're not doing this anymore. We know that some women in that community were like, I don't care if I'm married, I'm not having sex, I'm not having any more children with you. So some people were starting to practice asceticism. They were beginning to practice bodily autonomy, where they were like, actually, I'm deciding. Society is actually not deciding this for me. There's other aesthetics. There's other aesthetic movements in the ancient world. Christians are not the only one, but they are one of these people. Now, Paul's like, if you're married, please don't do that, because you're going to cause your spouse to sin.
Yeah.
So he says, don't do that for extended periods of time, because you're going to actually cause your spouse to go commit adultery or something like that. But we
Yeah.
see this movement where women, women especially, began to say, you know, they were empowered by the Jesus movement to say, yeah, I'm not doing this bullshit anymore. This sucks. Yeah,
Right.
I want. They wanted options and choices, and
Yeah.
by God, they saw within the liberation and freedom of Jesus that they could have that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Now, there's also, I don't know if your book touches on this or if you have any thoughts about this, but like there's also a very sort of let's just put it this way. I've never heard any sermons on this topic, but the place where Jesus after he answers a question about marriage and sort of blows everybody's minds about that the woman can sort of actually be the one to say, you know what, I'm going to break the marriage covenant, and so like, whoa, like why even get married? They say, well, they're like blows their mind. But then he goes, well, here's this other thing that is really difficult, and you probably can't accept it right now, but maybe one day you'll be ready to understand this. And then he goes into the thing about eunuchs, right? There are eunuchs who are made this way, that are born this way, and those who choose to be eunuchs for the kingdom. And it seems to be it's more about he's trying to kind of float the idea for them in their minds that it's possible to choose not to participate in what they would consider normative sexual or relationships and things like this, which again also blows their minds. But what are your thoughts about that? What that particular passage? What do you think Jesus is trying to say there or do there?
Yeah, so many things, right? And in my work, this passage is often interpreted by people who are wondering about homoeroticism, homosexuality in the ancient world, and about trans identity, contemporary. And so like eunuchs are often made sort of compared to those two populations, which is problematic, but empowering.
It's not an exact
parallel.
I do understand that.
Yeah. But I think Jesus is also challenging ideas of ancient masculinity. Right. So to be our Latin word for man is vir, V-I-R. And that's where we get the word virility.
There you go.
So I think Jesus is also challenging this idea of that to be a man in the ancient world means sort of sexual prowess and also self-control. That's one of the things I study, what it means to have self-control, and that it means to be a patriarch, where you are at the top of the family line and everyone answers to you, and that's all dependent on your sort of sexual energy. So I think Jesus is also challenging that with this thing about eunuchs, and that some people are born eunuchs, so some people are born without the capability of having children, or of their if there's a, I don't know what the right word is, congenital. Right. Some kind of, if people are born with something congenital and they don't, their genitalia is not functional.
Yeah,
for sexual like something like that.
Intersex or hermaphrodites or things like this, where like they're physically born with either different parts or mixed parts or things that don't function in some way. And so
right. And also people who are made into a eunuch too.
Yeah, so we should say that their parts are not clearly male and female the way that we define that today. Well, they don't function. Yeah, they don't function in that for procreation in that sense.
Right. Well, yeah, and like intersex genitalia there's a range. There's like 8 different manifestations of intersex, and so I think it's just in terms of our contemporary identities, it's really within the scholarship we are seeing intersex as a sex. There's not male and female. There's male, female, and intersex.
And intersex, yeah. Versus you're saying versus a spectrum.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
But the point would still be, and again, unfortunately, I don't think we see any of this really, maybe a hint of it in Jesus' statement, but very slight hint. But we don't see it. There's no discussion of these, like, there's no even an acknowledgement of like, oh, by the way, there's male and female and other, like it's not binary, right? There's an assumed binary in scriptures.
There's an assumed binary. Although I think we see some slippage around that in the ancient world too. They did assume obviously it was patriarchal. They assumed a male and female, but we also see a lot of gender play in the ancient world and people trying on different identities. So for instance, as we as we kind of mentioned earlier, there was a sort of movement in early Christianity towards female asceticism. We also see new women in Roman culture in the early 1st century, where elite Roman women, if their first husband died or if they got divorced, they were like, not remarrying. I'm not doing it. They had control of their money. They had control of their sexuality. So they would go out and have many partners, many lovers, make these own choices for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And Augustus comes in at the first, in the days of Caesar Augustus, like we see in the very beginning of the Gospel of Luke. And Augustus is mildly horrified by this. And so he makes all of these kind of bonuses for Roman women who get married and have a certain number of children. So he's trying to sort of reinstitute this idea of the traditional. I mean, we're really, I think what we would call like the traditional family, the traditional Christian family, but the traditional Roman family.
Yeah.
So we see these women are actually, part of their criticism is that they're acting like men.
Yes.
So we see that gender slippage, too, in the ancient world.
But see, that seems to be something, I don't want to take us too far off track here, but I mean, that seems to be something in 1 Corinthians that Paul feels that he needs to attack or correct, right? It feels like he's really concerned about men and women kind of not staying in their lane, you know what I mean? So in his mind, this is why he's criticizing men who are effeminate. But by the way, that's what Malakoi means, not homosexual. That's another thing. But
soft, it means like
soft. Men who are soft or shave their beards or have long hair, and what in his mind would be a male who is not acting male enough, right? He's slipping over into or women, who don't cover their heads or who cut their hair. Or things like that. So again, in his mind, they're becoming more male, and so this is why he's like concerned about this goes against nature, and it feels like that he's really concerned about. Enough that he writes like a chapter worth of correction on this thing, because again, it was happening, or he wouldn't have said anything about it. But it seems like he's really concerned about like holding the reins and hold on, whoa, let's not slip off in these other directions.
It's interesting because I think Paul, I think the way I say it is like Paul around enslavement, I think gets some things right. Now, we wouldn't know that from reading Ephesians or Colossians, which I don't think Paul wrote, right? Like Ephesians and Colossians say like clearly obey your masters, obey your husband, right? They all go to this sort of male patriarch that's at the top of the.
Yes.
But in 1 Corinthians, I think we see Paul and women. So whereas I think Paul gets some things correct about enslavement, the ancient world, with women, he's halfsies. He's like on his way. I think he's on his way. But I think we see in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul says very clearly, if you get divorced because a partner has unbelief, don't get remarried. There's no reason to get remarried unless you're going to commit sexual sin.
Right.
If you're going to commit sexual sin, get remarried. So I think Paul is actually, as far as women are concerned within this particular chapter, this gives women a lot more freedom than they would traditionally have. And so in that sense, I think Paul is actually advocating, it's not equality, it's not egalitarianism. That's not, those words are not appropriate for the ancient world, but he's advocating a new way that's not within that patriarchal, as firmly within that patriarchal system.
Yeah.
And he says very clearly in 1 Corinthians 7, 2-5, spouses do touch each other. Don't be abstinent from your own spouses for longer than short amounts of time. But he says, women, you have authority over your husband's body.
Yes.
And
that's a progressive
authority.
statement.
Yeah. And husbands, you have authority over your wife's body. So I think we see some shifts in the way that Paul is helping people construct their Christian identity within their own gender framework.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's quite as simple as holding the line. And when Paul, I think he's also advocating actually that women could have the same self-control that a man can have.
Yeah.
In this. And that is remarkable.
Yeah. Well,
That is remarkable.
because self-control is basically the woman's right to tell her husband, not tonight, or not right now.
Well, your self-control, inkrateia is the word, right? So your self-control, it's associated with maleness in the ancient world, but it's ultimate control over your own personhood, over your desires.
Uh-huh.
So it's your ability to say, I desire this cookie, or I desire this woman, or I desire a beautiful soft bed, but I have enough self-control to not give in to my base desires.
Mm.
Women traditionally, again, in the sort of rhetoric, women were seen as needing male control because they would just give in to every desire.
They have to be controlled. They have to be controlled. They have to be
controlled. So in a very flip way of the way we think about of the stereotypes of genders today, where we think of, in sitcoms, it's men who are sex crazed. In the ancient world, it was women who were seen as being sex crazed. They had no control over their own desire. And that is shown through that that language of burning. It's better to marry than to be aflame with passion. It was women who were seen to be aflame,
Wow.
burning so hotly that they couldn't be controlled. And so I think when Paul actually suggests that like women can have self-control, it's suggested, but I think it's a radical statement.
Yeah. Yeah.
As far as women covering their hair, I'm most persuaded by the work of Maud Gleason, who associates this with a medical understanding in the ancient world of fertility.
Yeah. Is this
so that women's
Hippocratic thing?
I don't know which I would have to go back and look. I don't remember which medical field, if it falls into Hippocratic or one of the other doctors, but women's hair was thought to be hollow and it functioned like a vacuum.
Yes.
So the longer it is, the more the vacuum is, and it can suck the male seed into her body for fertility. And so when Paul says, cover your hair, he may be saying your hair is a sexual organ.
No, that's exactly right. So there's the first I heard of that was there's a guy named Dr. Michael Heiser, Heiser. He has a podcast called the Naked Bible Podcast. And he does it's not his own research, but he's sort of reading a paper that was presented at some, scholarly thing, or maybe it was published in some, research journal or something. And basically, it was the science of the time of that, in that early, first century, the medical science. And it was actually something published by Hippocrates, who is where we get the Hippocratic Oath.
Right.
So he was the leading scientist, medical, genius of the day. And it's wackadoodle for us, but if this is what they believed, they really thought that a woman's hair was part of her genitalia.
Yeah.
And it really was like this thing where that's why it had to be long, because the longer it was pulling semen up out of her, groin up into her, I guess, into her uterus or whatever.
Right.
And this is why it was in Paul's mind, it was unnatural for a man to have long hair, because it would do the same thing to the man. It would, the man's long hair would pull semen out of his body, and therefore he wouldn't be as fertile. Or virile or masculine.
Yeah, I think
it's so weird. It's such a weird thing, but this is actually what they believed.
Yeah.
And so if you understand that is Paul's assumption when you go and read those passages, then it does at least make sense in that context.
Yeah. And so the work of Maud Gleason is really helpful for that. If anyone wants to know more about medical science in the ancient world and the changing medical field, Annetta Weissenreiter's work is really, really good for that. And she was one of my on my committee. Yeah. Okay,
cool. Very cool. So I think you're right. That it's one of those weird things where, like, if you can go back and understand what they believed, it helps understand why they're saying certain things. So because I think if you don't understand it, then we tend to attribute some sort of divine edict. No, it's what God wants. God is saying this because that's why Paul is saying it, because the Holy Spirit revealed to Paul that this is the way it should be. That's not what's going on. Paul is appealing to what he thinks is the wisdom of the time, of the day.
Yeah.
And based on that, he's saying these things. So it's really more of a cultural understanding than it is anything, God has spoken, women must cover their hair.
Yeah, and I always encourage anyone when you're exploring any part of scripture, especially one that feels close to you or triggering or aggravating or puzzling, I encourage everyone to ask a couple of questions. And the first one is, what did this mean in the ancient world?
Yeah.
Figure that out. And
Yeah.
really, as much as you can, enter into that Zen observation
Yeah.
mode and just very as neutrally as possible. What did this mean in the ancient world? The Bible Odyssey website is really good for that. That's produced by the Society of Biblical Literature. It's free. It's totally free. It's written by scholars for a general audience. I have an article on slavery in there as well.
Now, what is the
So
address for that? How do you get
it's
to
BibleOdyssey.org.
.org?
Yeah, it's really, really well done.
Cool.
It's one of the better things that SBL has done, I believe. So what it mean in the ancient world, and in that observation process, I also encourage people to observe their own feelings. That's an important part. Write those down and just observe them as if you're observing yourself. How am I responding to this, right? So if you're super triggered by it, it may be even hard to understand what the first century meaning was.
Yeah.
So like kind of get that out. Like that's an important part of the process. And then what did it mean then? What does it mean today? And then only then are we in a position to interpret what does it mean for me?
Yeah. That's good. I
Right.
like that.
So that often the very first question we ask is, what does it mean? What we mean is, what does it mean to me? But it's too soon for that. We can't know that until we've worked with the passage a little.
Absolutely. Yeah, we skipped some steps there. And then I've found
Yeah.
that to be true in a lot of, especially in those cases, what typically becomes sort of the clobber passages, whether it's the passages about homosexuality or the passages like in First Timothy about women. I have benefited a lot from the research of people who have gone and done sort of the historical research to show that, well, like in First Timothy, for example, you need to back up and again, do what you just did. Ask this question: what did it mean to the people that were receiving this letter? So it's written to people in Ephesus. What was going on in Ephesus? Maybe we should understand what was happening in the first century in Ephesus. Oh, there was this Artemis worship. Well, what was that all about? And once you start digging into that, and you understand that, now go back and read those passages, and it connects all these dots, and it makes sense of some passages that are really confusing otherwise, like when Paul says women will be saved in childbirth. Oh, so there's a special way of women can be saved as compared to men. If women have babies, they get saved, but men are saved by the blood of Christ. What? But that is not at all what that means. But if you understand Artemis worship, you understand that, well, women who worshiped Artemis, they did it primarily because they wanted that their life and the life of their unborn child would be protected in childbirth. And the way they did that was to adorn their hair and to dress when these clothes. Oh, that Paul specifically addresses women adorning their hair. And it's not because he doesn't want them to look pretty. That's not his point.
Yeah, and it's not because of some curse in Genesis.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's only about, look, what's happening in Ephesus is there's a lot of these Gentile believers coming into the church who are maybe previously were very involved in Artemis worship, because it's like the main thing going on in Ephesus, which we even see in the book of Acts.
Right. Yeah.
And then once you understand, oh, okay, here's how women worshipped Artemis. Here's why they did it, so that they and their child would be saved in childbirth. If you understand all that, then when you read those passages, like women will be saved in childbirth if they follow Christ, if they, in other words, trust Jesus, you'll be fine. You don't need to go to Artemis, right, to any of this stuff. So that's all he's trying to say. But then this gets taken out of all this, we again, without that context, we read it and totally misunderstand what's being
right.
said.
Yeah. Yeah. And then we prioritize motherhood and like all this. Yeah.
Oh yeah, exactly.
Yes.
No, exactly.
Gender stuff. All right.
Yeah. It's kind of,
and just 10 years ago, it was like 10 years ago this month, I got to go to Ephesus, and I got to see that the many-breasted statue of Artemis.
Yeah.
Gorgeous.
Yeah.
So gorgeous.
How big is that? How large is that?
Human size.
Okay.
Yeah. I think there used to be a bigger one that no longer exists.
Yeah. I've just seen pictures of it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's like my height, or a little bit. I'm pretty tall compared to people 2,000 years ago. So maybe a little shorter than me, but the mini breasts, they may also be bull testicles, because they really don't look like breasts. Because that was also a symbol of fertility.
Wow. Okay. So have we covered this enough that we feel comfortable to transition a little bit into those that are going through deconstruction and moving?
Yeah. Let's talk about real world consequences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what advice do you have about that, or what things do you see that we, because again, before we hit record, you made a statement about how that the sexuality conversation is something that kind of doesn't get covered very much, or you see that it gets ignored in the deconstruction conversation. And I would just admit it probably gets ignored by me because I've not thought about how that is impacted for some people. So obviously you have, so help us think us through.
Right. Well, yeah. So let me, I can talk a little bit with my, just a little bit of my background and my story, and then see if that's helpful for kind of further conversation. Which is, I grew up very evangelical adjacent. And I think I mentioned in a Heretic Happy Hour, right, that, or in an episode coming up, that my parents worked really hard to sort of separate us from the local Southern Baptist culture. But I know, right? So, and so when I asked them when I was like 16 if I could join the big Southern Baptist church in town, they were just horrified. I mean, I think they were like, what? We've done all this work, so you don't have to, you're not into this. But their attitudes around sexuality, I love my parents, and but their attitudes around sexuality, they really retained the evangelical notions around sexuality, and those were very hammered into me as a young person, as a teenager. True love waits mentality. You must wait until you're married before you have any sexual relationship. I think they were kind of moderate around like homosexuality when I was a teenager. Now they're very progressive. I mean, now they're fully supportive of LGBTQI inclusion, as am I.
Good.
So all this kind of stuff. So my middle sister, I'm the youngest by quite a lot. So when she was 19, I was like 12 or 13. She got pregnant outside of marriage, and my parents, they talked to me about it. She ended up they were engaged. They ended up getting married just a lot earlier. But like there was so much shame.
Yeah.
In the family circle around this. And I remember when they talked to me, they were like, well, she's really embarrassed. Like their shame was just like, kind of pouring out of them. And I didn't really adopt that. I remember that at the time. I didn't really adopt it. And I was like, I'm not sure. I was like, everyone seems really embarrassed. I'm really not sure what this is all about. And I was like, we love Peggy and Sean. Sorry, sis, just outed you. But I was like, we love Peggy and Sean. And I was like, they're getting married. Like, let's just be supportive. Like, what else is there? What else is there to do? And I remember my dad was kind of moved, I think, by that. I mean, I was young at the time, and he told my sister, and she came to me later and was like, oh, thank you for saying that. Like, fine, she's being shamed while also trying to deal with this huge monumental life change, for her. And so that's just like one example. And so I think it was from that moment forward, I was kind of like, I'm not doing all this anymore. I can't do all this anymore. So many years later, this emerges into me like working on sexuality in the ancient world and kind of in a continuous process of deconstruction. And certainly I had my own questions around homosexuality when I was a younger person before I moved into kind of full inclusion and how to navigate that. And now one part of my research is on trans identity and the New Testament, and how trans persons of faith see themselves within the story and how the story can empower them. So but this dimension of sexuality is so tied to shame, to guilt, to control of someone else's body, and to this sort of idea that like, if you commit sexual sin, and I'm putting that in the biggest apostrophes I possibly can, but like however that's defined within your community of faith, it's like this stain on your soul and it never leaves the soul. And it's also damaging. It's just not the Jesus story. Yeah. So, with that, I think part of Reconstruction is figuring out what are the values that align with you and your story, and those can look different, as long as we're all acting with consent and within a basic ethical framework. Mm-hmm. And then what are the work we need to do to transform any kind of shame, any kind of guilt, and anger. We may feel anger at our communities of faith. Yeah. For this kind of view of sexuality. So, I grew up in this kind of Southern Baptist framework, especially around sexuality, and I went to Catholic school. So y'all, you want to talk about any kind of shame and guilt around sex? I've experienced it. Yeah. So, and I definitely grew up with the idea of like, oh my God, if you have sex with anyone who's like who's had sex with anyone, you're going to get every disease
Yes.
that ever existed, right? Like that's just like this fear, right? Instead of kind of a healthy mode of sexuality.
Yeah.
So yes, what would be helpful to kind of continue to untangle that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think again, thank you so much, because I think, yeah, the shame and the guilt and it is about control. And it is also about like, there's just no, this is what seems like so wrong about it. Like from the Christian standpoint, like there's just no grace there. And again, I think the assumption is, I think this is the worst part of it. It's not just that, well, your parents are embarrassed. It's not just that, well, the church is embarrassed or, is going to treat you this way. It's the assumption that this is how God sees you. Like,
right.
It's this ultimate thing of like, well, God is so disappointed in you. You've always been a worm, but man, you've
right.
really,
Yeah. Now it's like, it's like ground into the very fabric of your soul is, has this dark coffee stain on it now or something.
Even the blood of Christ will never wash.
Right. Yes. Never wash you clean.
Never wash you clean. Because we'll never forget it. Right. Then that's really what it is. It's not God. It's people around you. It's Christians around you.
Yeah.
They have decided to hold the offense, to never let it go, to never let you forget it.
Yeah.
Never let you escape it or rise above it or any of that. And but it's even the assumption that you need to, that you have to rise above it, or you know what I mean? Like it's not just like you're a human being.
Yeah.
You have the same urges everybody else does, which are God-given and designed. And this happened, and so let's celebrate a new life, right? Let's be glad that you're going to have this baby and raise this child, and how beautiful this is, right?
Yeah, or even thinking about so many I just know so many women who grew up with this idea that their sexuality is not their own.
Yeah.
It's owned.
Yes.
I mean, it's a very ancient patriarchal idea, right? It's owned by a father and then transferred to a husband.
Yes, and that's like the piece of that whole true love waits thing, right? Like the promise rings, and then like the father takes his daughter to the dance, and he's sort of the surrogate husband,
holding her like virginity.
Yes, and then he gets
the creepiness is a lot. Yeah,
to pass her off to the husband, and then and see now, thank God I didn't grow up with any of that kind of stuff, and Wendy didn't either, but definitely have seen people who are kind of in that, and it's that that really, and it becomes this really toxic thing in the marriage, or in a Christian marriage, where the woman is almost programmed to play along with that, like to celebrate it. Like, yes, I'm a baby factory, and I'm here to serve my husband like a slave, and he's the greatest thing, and my job is to just make him the center of my universe, and like all that kind of stuff. And when I see that, man, it's just twisted. It's so
skewed. And there's a lot of degrees within there.
Yeah.
As well. And so for people as they're deconstructing all of this and building something new, I see a lot people who are in marriages where they're actually very happy within their marriage. There's no desire to sort of leave, and sometimes they're not, and any of the above is okay, but they've entered into the relationship with these assumptions. And then the assumptions are beginning to change. You're beginning to reconstruct. So I actually really encourage people as they're, if you're deconstructing and reconstructing with a partner, with a spouse, to do that together. And maybe it's time to kind of like, you can have a ritual or a ceremony to kind of ritually undo some of the assumptions that maybe you entered into the relationship with, and now recommit with a new set of assumptions, because we're always growing.
What would that look like? Are there some specific examples that you?
Yeah, well, I should write out a little liturgy or something. But that'd be fun to do, actually. But I can just imagine just a very simple ceremony that you might have with one another. We honor the people that we were when we entered in this commitment with the idea that we were shameful. Like, I mean, it's really the idea that like sex within marriage is your salvific key to your sexuality, which is it's not possible. If that was possible, we wouldn't have so many unhappy marriages, right?
Exactly.
Right. So so kind of honoring the people that we were, but now saying, if you were going to rewrite your vows now, what would those be?
There you go.
Yeah, rewrite them for your contemporary state.
Yeah. Well,
You know, and
yeah, obey kind of thing. Yeah.
yeah, honor, obey, but also this idea that like I was supposed to really hate the idea of sex before I met you.
Right.
That's not reasonable.
Right.
That's not reasonable.
Yeah.
And yeah, I know so many women, probably men too, who once they get married, they've been taught to hate the idea of sex, that it's shameful. Oh,
Yeah.
until you get married, and then it's great, and then they get married, they're like, actually, I just still feel shame.
No, see, that's
Yeah,
exactly right. Like I've met people, I've tried to counsel people who have come to me and said, like one was a guy I worked with, and he was a Christian guy, and he was like, Keith, I need to talk to you. And we go into the room and shut the door, and he starts telling me that basically his wife, they're both Christians, like it's like for his wife, that switch never
yeah, and
flipped
then never
over.
get flipped.
In other words, it did such a wonderful job convincing her from a very young age that sex is dirty and evil and wrong and makes Jesus cry and all that, that now she's married and she cannot have a
Still
sexual
feels that
relationship with
way.
her husband.
Yeah.
And so he's like, what the hell? Like, what's going on here? And it's really difficult. So it was, I don't even know. They probably got a divorce by now. I can't imagine. Because I mean, I kept trying to give him some advice and blah, 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 but it's like, there's not much he can do. It's really kind of like she's the one that has all this stuff she's got to work out.
Yeah.
And he doesn't know how to help her do that, And of course, I can tell him
Yeah.
what not to do. Don't pressure
Right.
her, don't force her, don't
Right.
shame her, don't, whatever, because that's just going to push her farther away. But it's more like, well, maybe she needs some counseling or therapy or something. I don't know.
Well,
It
the
just feels
shame,
like,
yeah, the shame often exists to prevent us from something else. Right?
yeah,
So the shame is there. I mean, it's programmed in from lots of different messages, from misinterpretation, as we've seen of scripture,
yeah,
in my mind, where Old Testament talks a lot about pleasure. But that also the shame also serves to prevent us from feeling pleasure,
yeah,
from experiencing the full range, because we have fear around that.
yes,
So that shame is worthwhile exploring. And again, if you can do that from a really neutral perspective, kind of observe yourself, ask some questions, what is it that the shame needs to continue? And what does it need to transform
yeah,
as well? Right. So I think that's the dangers of making a lot of assumptions about sexuality in the New Testament, especially in the Old Testament as well. Whereas it's more helpful maybe if we see there's a range.
yeah,
There's diverse expressions
yeah,
of sexuality in the New Testament. And of course, I've spoken to so many people also who deny their own sexual orientation or their own gender identity.
yeah.
And they got married at a very early age. And as they're deconstructing and reconstructing, that means a shift.
Yes.
That means
Oh,
a
I've seen
shift.
that as well too. I've
Yeah.
actually have friends that have, as they've deconstructed some of these things in their theology, they've started to realize that they have been repressing their own desires and their own identity because, well, it's sinful to be gay or bi
Right.
or whatever. And so the right thing, the godly thing to do, God's will for my life is to marry someone of the opposite sex and have a family and have children. And so they've done that. But now they've deconstructed and now they're sort of like, they feel like, to be true and to be honest, I just have to say, I like I like people of the same sex. And now what
Right.
do I
Yeah.
do? And no, like actually one of the people that I talked to like that is and he's very open about this, is Jamie Arpin Reese. You know who he is?
I don't.
He's an author, Christian author. He has some things published with InterVarsity, although I think they dropped him after he sort of came out. I talked to him about that, and it was really tough. And in his case, he was able to be honest with his wife about his feelings, and he's remained married. And but many people I've talked to who they've done this feel like they can't remain married, and then they end up leaving their spouse
Yeah.
because they
I
feel
mean,
like they're not being true to who they are.
and I think that, my experience is that God is so pleased when we're in our full, authentic selves.
Yeah,
And we have this Christian bifurcation of our bodies and our souls that says your desires and your gender and your sexuality is actually distinct from your soul.
yes,
And so you can keep these two things separate.
yes,
And I think when we have that union and that integration and that a full embodied awareness of who we are, God is this thrills God.
Yeah.
So within that framework of deconstruction and reconstruction, there's a lot of avenues to go that are ethical, right? So for this individual, staying married while his identity is as a gay man. I know for a lot of people that won't work for, but it's not an unethical decision.
Yeah.
Right. As long as he's honoring the full integrity of who he is. And there's also a lot of integrity in getting divorced.
Yeah.
And entering into a new frame, a new awareness of your own identity.
Yes.
Your own desires. So, if there's one thing I wish for sort of the whole Christian community, it's that we see our whole selves as sacred.
Yeah.
That all of this is sacred. It's not when we can transform from that shame into the sacredness of who we are.
So
there's power there.
Yeah, if I understand what you're saying, I think there may be something we need to make sure people understand what we're saying. I think as we're deconstructing and moving into reconstruction, that it is important to recognize that one of the things we need to deconstruct is this idea that sexuality is bad or shameful, or we should feel guilt or shame over our sexuality. That is part of holistically who we are, created in the image of God, people who are dearly loved of God, like it's our whole being, our whole person.
Yeah.
And that our sexuality is part of that. And we don't need to apologize for that or separate that from our identity. Like that's all included and it's all good in God's eyes. It's all part of who we are. And it's not, on the one hand, I guess it's not helpful to continue to separate those two things.
Right.
And it actually could be damaging to us to go along with this idea that it's separate from who we are.
Yeah, it's damaging, and it means that we're not fully present in the present moment.
Yep.
We're not fully present to who we are. That means we're living up here and sort of not in the totality of ourselves. And I'm guilty. I mean, I told Keith before we started, like I can get really in my head. So bring me back down to earth. I do it as much as anyone else. But yeah, that's all sacred. And I see so many people too, when they've ignored these dimensions of themselves, there's the byproduct is, or the coping mechanism is, we numb ourselves. Yeah. We can numb ourselves through substance abuse. We can numb ourselves through other forms of addiction. And then we're trying to feel in other ways. So then we have other self-destructive behaviors that are trying to get us to feel anything.
Yeah.
And so that kind of product of shame. So I encourage anyone who's been struggling with that at any level to do your own curious exploration, and enter into your most full authentic self. And that's a process. It does not happen overnight. It takes a couple of years.
It is a process. And I have a friend who is a Christian, who is deconstructing, who is gay, and yet he's not at peace with it. He still feels, and I've tried to help him see this, that it's not what the scriptures say. It's not what all these clobber passages, let's walk through them. This is not what's actually happening here. But he can't, I guess I should say, thank you for saying that it's a process. Like that's not where he's at right now. I have hopes that eventually he's going to get to the place where he can see himself as someone that he could actually say and believe that it's okay for him to be gay. God, that's not a sin. He's not an abomination. But even when you're deconstructing, you can still hold on to these ideas and still be convinced that no, yes, I'm gay. I can be totally honest about that, the fact that I'm gay or trans or bi or whatever. However, I'm still believing these things I was raised with, that by being gay or bi or trans or whatever, there's something broken or wrong or dirty about me that is something that God still has to heal, or I still need to reconcile it, or I don't understand where.
Or I have to live a celibate. Existence.
No, exactly.
As well.
Because the sexual act, the same sex interaction, the physical act is disgusting to God and abomination. And again, that's exactly right. Yeah.
And so this is where I think with, especially with scripture, it's really helpful, again, that just really simple, 3-part process. what did this mean, and just kind of observe that and live with it for a little while. Okay, maybe this doesn't mean what I thought it meant. Because if we just simply encounter Romans 1:28, we're going to live in a panic. That's actually not going to be helpful. We're going to say, what does this mean to me right now? And actually, you're not ready for that yet.
That's right.
And I'm not either, y'all. I mean, I'm as guilty as anyone. When I start a scholarly article, I'm like, I gotta figure out what this means. I'm like, oh, what's the process? I have to figure that out over a process.
Yeah.
I have to live with it. But yeah, so what did this mean? Live with it. And your own observations are part of that.
Yes.
And then what does this mean today? And this is a great time to consult queer-friendly resources. There's a zillion out there. Queer positive, queer positive, sex positive resources written by people who are people of faith.
Yes.
And so that just seeing that there's a diversity of opinion, the narrow slice of theological import around sexuality is only a slice. And there's other options.
That's exactly right. Yes. Yeah. And so that's something where, I want to be able to help people if I can get through that. I mean, it's one thing to help a straight person who sort of judges gay people to think through this and back up and go, oh, no, I shouldn't do that. I'm so sorry. Now I thank you. I have a new framework now. And that's important. But it gets to be even more important when it's helping someone who is gay or trans or bi or whatever to process it so that they can accept themselves and can believe that God loves them and accepts them for who they are.
Yeah.
That's
an embodied experience. Yeah.
That's when it's much more, I see it just as much more important. And so, so I thank you, by the way, because again, I hadn't thought about, I guess, specifically how much the sexuality conversation really does play into deconstruction and reconstruction. But now, thank you. You've helped me see.
Oh, sure. Yeah. There's so many assumptions. There's so many assumptions. There's so many gendered assumptions that are in there. And, even within, what did I put? I think there was some AntiTrans rhetoric a couple of months ago. And I wrote a very simple thing about it on social media that just said, I know what it was. It was when I got the census. I was super annoyed. Didn't fill out that damn thing. I was super annoyed that the only check your gender, which is stupid. It should be sex.
Yeah.
What is your sex? Not what is your gender. They're two different things. And I was super annoyed that the only choice was male, female. At least it didn't say man and female, but it said male and female.
Right.
I was super annoyed. I was like, I'm not filling out this bullshit. I'm not gonna do it. Like I'm not filling this out. And I put something about that online. I was just like, I'm really disappointed that the census only had these options. And a church friend of mine, not from my local church, but within my denomination, she was like, oh, don't be upset. God only made 2 genders. And I was like, I am not reacting to this. I will respond. And I did. And I just said, part of my research is on trans identity and the New Testament. So I'd be happy to talk about that with you anytime that you want. But obviously I disagree.
And did they set up a time? Have you?
No, she has not.
Put that on the calendar.
But we are in relationship.
Right.
We are in relationship. So
yes,
it is not a broken relationship. But I was like, that's that typical kind of rhetoric. I think deserves some expansion.
Well, I totally agree. I mean, and I see those comments all the time too. And it's like, I mean, I get where it comes from. I guess it's just it's ignorance. It's again, we are definitely raised in a very binary culture. And certainly if you're a Christian, you're raised in this God made man and woman, male and female. And this is this is it, again, in that context, at that time, this is what they're understanding. And then this ancient primitive way of thinking, this is what they saw and experienced and understood and really focused on. Got it. But we now know, and there were dozens and hundreds, probably millions of examples of, and studies that have been done that, no, it's not just male and female. So God did not just make male and female. There's a range. And we just need to, acknowledge this. And
I think we see that diversity actually built into Genesis 1.
Yeah.
God is called they.
Right.
God encompasses all genders.
Yes.
And no gender.
Yeah, right.
For people who see themselves as agender.
Yeah.
That God holds all of that. And I think that's actually beautifully expressed in the very passage that's so often meant to reinforce binary thinking.
Yeah.
In Genesis 1, 26 through 28.
Yeah.
God creates the range of humanity, and God encompasses that range and more. So
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot of gender expressions that I hadn't thought of yet.
Yeah.
But God
Yeah.
holds those. God's got me covered on those for the day when I explore, or the day when humans in 1,000 years
Yeah.
begin to explore that. God has all of that covered. And we see, for instance, the person of Joseph in Genesis is very effeminate,
Mm-hmm.
and that's celebrated. He becomes the vizier
Yes.
of Egypt,
Yes.
right? He becomes an Egyptian too. And so, there's so much more than when we think in a binary way. We put that in scripture.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, well, to me, one of the most shocking Old Testament examples is the relationship between David and Jonathan.
Yeah.
Whether or not that is a full-on homosexual relationship or not, I mean, if you really just read the story, read the passages, read the way they speak to one another. They were talking about this love they have for one another is greater than the love for women.
Yeah, for women, yeah.
My gosh, it's a friendship, but man, it's a very affectionate friendship where
It is.
and which again like kind of goes beyond what most of us even today would consider okay or normal or whatever. But here it is right there in the Old Testament, and it's celebrated. It's like, nope, there it is. That's just what it is.
Yeah. And I love that actually in scripture and in other ancient stories, we see male close friendships in a way that's automatically stigmatized as, let me rephrase what I was about to say. We see close male friendships, and when we see close male friendships today, among people who are anti-gay, that stigmatizes being gay as a bad thing.
Yeah.
But there's this idea that like men can't be truly emotionally close,
Right.
as well.
Yes.
And so that's, so actually I love that dimension of David and Jonathan in many ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, for that reason. See, I think we see the same thing with like Patroclus and Achilles in the Odyssey. We see it, or is it the Iliad? I forget which one now. I think in the Iliad. We see that throughout the ancient world in a way that's not honored in our American culture today, that needs to be.
Yeah, and so that's interesting, because that's one of those things where in many ways maybe they were more progressive than we are, and we kind of take them because they were very primitive and they were
Yeah,
old
no,
school.
I think that if we see ancient people as being at least as sophisticated as we are, if not more.
Yes.
And if we stop associating sophistication with technology, things open up.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Now, this has been so good, Katy. I appreciate it so much. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Oh, super fun for me.
Yeah, helping us think through some of these things. So, real quick, I mean, where can people follow you more, find out more about you and the things you're doing? And do you have a website? Do you have a blog?
I do. Yeah. But
yeah,
so website's easy place to find me. So it's Katy Valentine, and that's Katy Valentine, not an IE. That will lead you to a porn star, actually. So Katy. So speaking about sexuality.
Yes.
I don't know if she's still a star. She was 10 years ago. Yeah. And then we haven't really talked about it much here, but I help Christians integrate metaphysical practices into their faith life. So if anyone wants to join my Facebook group, The Metaphysical Christian,
Cool.
We have a lot of fun there. We talk about chakras and your whole person, your whole being, your sexuality. That does actually come up in there. From time to time. So that's an important part of your connecting.
Yeah.
So those are the two best places to find me and the work that I'm doing.
That's cool. And then you also do, in addition to the Heretic Happy Hour, you also have another podcast you work on.
I do, right? Magical Mystical Journeys. And so in this podcast, we explore we call them ascended beings every episode. So like so far we've explored Metatron and Angel. We've explored Saint Bridget. We explored what was in season 1. It's all escaping me now. But anyway, yeah, we take one fascinating being, and we're in the middle of season 2 right now, and we're expanding beyond the Judeo-Christian canon as well. So that's really fun. So it's for those of you that are super woo-woo and you've wondered, can you connect with these beings and energies? Come listen to Magical Mystical Journeys. We'll connect them for you.
Yeah. So if we could do this again sometime, it would be interesting to explore the sort of woo-woo metaphysical stuff.
Oh, let's do it. I'm all for the woo-woo all the time.
Because see, you could definitely take me. You could expand my horizons in that area. That would actually be really good.
We'll take any topic you want and
Okay.
go to the angelic heights with it. It'll be fun.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Katie.
Thanks,
I appreciate
Keith.
it. Awesome. Bye-bye.